Hello and welcome to Your Questions Answered on BBC News. We call it YQA for short. We've been looking at what you're searching for on the BBC website about the Israel-Gaza war. And so, for the next few minutes, we'll try and get you some answers with our team of correspondents. So with me to answer some of them are security correspondent Frank Gardner and our Middle East analyst Sebastian Usher. Nice to see you both. Thank you for being here. Also joining us, our Middle East correspondent Tom Bateman, who is in Jerusalem. Welcome to you too as well, Tom. Frank, let me start with you because one of the most obvious questions right now, and we've had this news confirmed that President Biden will travel to Israel. Why is he going? What can he do there?
This is incredibly unusual. It normally takes weeks, if not months of planning for a US president to make an official visit like this. The Secret Service will deploy first, weeks in advance, searching everywhere that he's going to be with sniffer dogs, recceing the route that he's going to take. For Air Force One to come in at this critical time shows just how seriously and how concerned the White House is about this war spinning out of control. The US has two concerns. One is the fact that there are clearly a huge amount of civilian casualties, that these are not so-called surgical strikes, an awful expression, but, you know, they understand Israel's need to respond to the atrocities that were committed in southern Israel on October the 7th, but they want Israel to show a bit of restraint, which it doesn't appear to be showing much of at the moment. And the second is they're deeply worried about it spinning out of control, about it sucking in, drawing in other countries, notably Iran, and its proxy force Hezbollah in southern Lebanon.
Yeah, let's talk to Tom Bateman, who's in Jerusalem. And Tom, I wonder how this will be viewed there. How will this visit go down in Jerusalem?
Well, it's going to be absolutely critical for Benjamin Netanyahu, this visit, because remember, actually, before this crisis and war began, Benjamin Netanyahu was in serious political trouble. This country had had unprecedented protests for nearly a year against his hardline ultra-nationalist government. Now, in the course of that, Benjamin Netanyahu hadn't had an invite to the White House since he was elected late last year. And for an Israeli prime minister, that was becoming deeply embarrassing for him. It was leading to lots of questions because Joe Biden was basically pretty angry about the ultra-nationalist makeup of Benjamin Netanyahu's government. He didn't like it. He certainly didn't want to reward Mr. Netanyahu with a visit to the White House. So politically, this is really important in terms of sort of bolstering what we now have is an emergency wartime government in Israel. Opposition figures have come in, and this is the most visible signal you can get that Mr. Biden is absolutely backing the state of Israel in a time of what they see as historic crisis. So it really matters. And as Frank was talking about those two absolutely key objectives, it's also a signal to Iran. You know, we've heard the rhetoric absolutely ratcheting up in the last 24 hours from the Iranians, talking about the potential for, you know, a clear escalation, trying to deter an Israeli ground invasion into Gaza. So this is about security, global security, and it's about the political support for Israel at the moment.
Tom, stay with us. A few more questions to ask you over the coming minutes, but let me bring in Sebastian at this point. And Tom raised the point there, didn't it? It's this idea of, unconditional support, unequivocal support. Does that embolden Israel? And I guess, is there a point when that starts to run out, that unconditional support?
I mean, emboldening Israel is one way of looking at it. I think in terms of the influence that the US has on Israel, I mean, this blows hot and cold to some extent. I mean, what is true that whatever the nature of a US government, whatever temporary fallouts they may have within Israel, as Tom was saying there, as President Biden has had with Netanyahu over the past few months, when it comes down to it, America stands 100% with Israel. I mean, it sees Israel as essentially almost a projection of itself in the Middle East, the only democracy in the Middle East, as they always like to say, espousing the values that the US prides itself on, and as a key ally regionally in all the conflicts and problems that there are there. The conditions as such, I mean, what the US has wanted to do is to portray itself also as a relatively even-handed mediator between Israel and the Palestinians in order, despite this slight hiccup when President Trump was in power, but over the past few decades, the two-state solution at the moment, there's no real momentum in that process whatsoever, hasn't been for some years, but there's been talk of that again all around from the US and beyond, that this could be an opportunity when the war is over to look at that, because we've seen the abyss and this might be the only way out of it. So in terms of conditionality there, I mean, the US has criticised Israel most regularly about the settlements. The settlements, I mean, clearly are seen internationally as the biggest obstacle to any kind of peace, to any kind of setting up of two states. The way they've developed over the past 20 years has meant that more and more of a territory that would have been Palestinian is now going to be more and more difficult, if there ever is a resolution on that, to actually hand it over, to remove the settlers. So there have been a lot of fallouts over that, and there's been more criticism over that under the Biden administration, certainly than we heard under President Trump, but more to what we are used to. But as I say, when it comes down to it, and as Frank was saying there, I mean, this is both about what President Biden wants to achieve in the way this conflict is going, but also wants to make a huge gesture of solidarity with the Israeli people.
Frank, on the other side of this conflict is Hamas. And interesting, that warning coming from Iran this morning, saying that Israel will not be allowed to act in the Gaza Strip without consequences, warned of pre-emptive action, they say, in the coming hours. Why is Iran such a backer of Hamas?
Well, both are dedicated to the destruction of the State of Israel. They don't think that Israel should exist, even within its pre-1967 borders. Just to be clear, the Palestinian Authority, which rules in the West Bank out of Ramallah, does believe in a two-state solution, is prepared to live side by side with an Israeli state. Iran has funded, supported, trained, armed, equipped a number of proxies around the Middle East, the most famous of being Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is not only a military force but a political force. It is the strongest element, the strongest force in Lebanon. If Iran and Hezbollah decided the time was right, then if Hezbollah was to unleash its arsenal of missiles and rockets on Israel, then Israel would find itself fighting a war on two fronts, in the south in Gaza and in the north in Lebanon. And this arsenal is substantial. Hezbollah are probably better trained, better equipped, better armed than Hamas. Israel fought a war with them in 2006. I helped cover it out of Jerusalem. And the Israelis thought that they could win that war just from the air. And they couldn't. They went in on the ground with their Merkava tanks, and they got ambushed really severely by Hezbollah. Hezbollah really gave them a bloody nose. Nobody won that war. It was unfinished business. So that would be a very serious blow. It's not clear that Hezbollah want to actually go to war with them right now.
That's exactly the thing. I mean, at the moment, the skirmishes that are happening on the border are remaining within the sort of rules of engagement between Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah clearly wants to send a signal, but they're getting more intense every single day. I mean, we just had a few hours ago 4 people trying to get across to plant an explosive were killed by the Israelis, but they haven't said it was Hezbollah because there's Palestinian factions at work there as well. And the one thing to say about Hezbollah, as you say, they're a huge power within the Lebanese state, and they look to that as well. They're not just looking towards Israel and what Iran says. They also have to think of themselves as a rational player within the Lebanese context, which in a sense reins them in a little more than, say, Hamas, who essentially only are answerable to themselves.
Don't forget that you've got 2 US Navy aircraft carrier strike groups cruising just offshore in the Eastern Mediterranean as a warning to Iran and Syria possibly, don't get involved. This is not your fight, stay out of it. So that if Hezbollah did get involved, there is a risk that I think that this would bring in the US Navy, who would start using their missiles and their massive strike force of aircraft to target Hezbollah, and which would internationalize this whole conflict.
Yeah, and that really is the challenge. And when we get a sense of who are those supporters around the world, just bring us up to reminders, Frank, if you will. Who is supporting Israel right now? Well,
primarily primarily the United States as its closest ally, but also most Western nations have given it rhetorical support, often mixed with humanitarian aid for the Palestinians. So Britain, for example, is giving $10 million of aid, but is politically supporting Israel because of the sheer barbarity and extent of that attack on October the 7th, that Saturday morning. The similarities with ISIS. But that said, Western countries are now getting very concerned about the appalling death toll and the casualties and the misery inflicted in Gaza by Israeli airstrikes and the blockade.
A reminder, people are watching your questions answered. These are the questions that people are submitting online. There's much more detail on all of these stories on BBC News Online, bbc.com/news. And let's talk, and let me bring back in Tom, who's in Jerusalem. And Tom, let's talk about what happens next. One of the questions that's being asked a lot online is, has Israel ever lost a war? And that could be a significant question going forward.
Well, it's quite a hard question to answer that, because there are those who would say that inside and outside of Israel that in a sense Israel always feels itself at war ever since its foundation in 1948 as a new Jewish state in this wider Arab region. There have been many Arab-Israeli wars, state on state, between Arab neighbours and the Israelis, and also since 1967 Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territory. So those Palestinians have lived under occupation. They will say they feel like this is a sort of ongoing war, and in a sense internally the front lines of that sort of move around. It's never particularly calm. But in terms of traditional war, I mean, Frank mentioned 2006, where Hezbollah claimed a victory. You know, you had after Israel had withdrawn from southern Lebanon in 2000, and elements of that from right back to 1982, Israel's invasion of Lebanon and driving the PLO, Yasser Arafat's PLO, out of Beirut. Elements of that were deeply unpopular among Israelis. But I think probably the most sort of qualified military failure that's always seen historically by Israelis is the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Now, this was when the Egyptians and the Syrians launched a sneak attack. And in some senses, you know, this was 50 years ago this month. It's had this huge resonance with the Hamas attack and the atrocities of this week, which were so unexpected on a sort of historical level. Many people have thought back to what happened in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Although, again, that was states, that was armies against armies. It didn't have this same sense of, you know, civilians being the very sort of atrocious target of much of this. But that's often seen as a big failure by Israel, a failure of intelligence. Although they drove back the Egyptians and the Syrians and retook the territories that they had already occupied in the Golan Heights and the Sinai, it led in effect years later to a peace treaty and a territorial retreat by the Israelis.
Tom, really good to have you there. Thank you. And Sebastian, let me ask you this quickly. It seems maybe perhaps flippant to talk about people just visiting the region, perhaps on holiday, but it's important. Is it safe, is the question that people are searching for online. Can they visit the region, maybe to Egypt, for example, or to other countries that are near Israel and Gaza?
I mean, I think to Egypt, and what you're not going to see, and as was essentially being explained by Tom there, you're not going to see Arab states themselves involved in a direct war with Israel over this. I mean, Egypt, Jordan, you know, the countries that are nearest, they're safe, but you are going to be in a very fevered, frenzied time. There's going to be lots of protests. There's going to be, you know, unrest on the streets, definitely, which will build as this goes on. So in major cities, you'd have to think carefully about whether you wanted to be there. Lebanon, I mean, from my friends, from people there, I mean, people are leaving Lebanon like nobody's business. Strangely enough, they were talking about this several weeks before this happened. They were saying, we're expecting something big to happen. Don't come to Lebanon this year. And people are not going.
Sebastian, Frank, really good to have you both with us. And thank you, of course, to Tom Bateman, who was in Jerusalem for us. You are watching BBC News.